Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 181, September 2nd to September 8th, 1864. Last week, we covered the end of the Atlanta campaign. The end result is that another key city for the South has fallen into Union hands. While much of the infrastructure had been removed prior to the siege, it was still going to be a key victory for the Lincoln administration. So symbolic, if nothing else, and certainly destruction to the Confederate morale. We will get into what happens in that theater in a future episode. This week, we need to talk about cavalry actions. We need to talk about the end of John Hunt Morgan and the famous Beefsteak raid. Before we get into either of those, let's talk a little bit about our Patreon content. And of course, this last month, we had an episode, it was a picture slideshow of some of our lesser known locations, or I guess lesser visited, it would probably be a better way to phrase that, locations around Richmond and what it's like going to those, and the historical significance, of course, of them. And we will be posting shortly a episode on poetry where we're reading some poems. It's a little bit of a different tack than we have had before in the Patreon episode, so if that sounds like it would interest you, and if any of our picture slideshows of modern day battlefields, we're going to be doing one about the crater here as well. We did a little bit of a content on the crater in July, so I wanted to kind of space it out a little bit, and we will be taking another picture slideshow, taking a look about what the modern day crater looks like. We also did memoir reviews, and we've done movie reviews as well. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description, and those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. So first, we'll talk about Wade Hampton. Now, really, the last time we have truly checked in on Wade Hampton maybe was the Battle of Trevilian Station. Much in terms of credit can be given to Hampton. While that battle was not really a clear-cut victory, it did end a federal raid that could have seen some real damage, and it did restore confidence in the Confederate mounted wing. The loss of Jeb Stuart was keenly felt, and someone needed to take over. Hampton was seemingly a good fit, especially following that battle. In fact, there had been rumblings that Hampton should go and take over in the sub-theater of the war, and try to turn the cavalry around there, which is less effective, although Wheeler did a good job in turning in a good performance in the latter stages of the Atlanta campaign, as we have already discussed. In my opinion, though, it's Wheeler. I haven't really talked too much about Joe Wheeler. In my opinion, it's really kind of too little too late. I think Wheeler gets a lot of his praise, a lot of his hype over some of these actions that really don't mean a whole lot, right? And he's not as effective a leader as Jeb Stuart, Nathan Bedford Forrest, or even Wade Hampton, in my opinion. He's a decent cavalry commander, and he does have bright sparks, but obviously he is not really the best guy for the job. Really, he was a Bragg partisan, a guy who was going to get along with Bragg, and then he has some questionable performances throughout the war. Well, as it stood in August and September of 1864, there needed to be more effort on the part of the rebels. Remember that Lee is interested in lifting the siege. We have highlighted how there are some logistical power coming in, so harassment of the Union supply system would be important. Hampton would be just the guy to do it, and he would do it in the same way Jeb Stuart might have. A large amount of the cattle were being held at Coggins Point, not too far from Grant and City Point. City Point, of course, we talked about that with the bomb at City Point. That's a big logistical area for the Union, so where a lot of the supplies are coming in, and it has been that way for quite some time. Remember that City Point is where the supplies are supposed to come in for the Second Corps prior to what was supposed to be their initial assault on Petersburg all the way back in June, so it has been that way for quite some time. Hampton could get valuable supplies for the Army of Northern Virginia and also hamper the Federals with a strike at this location. Now, Confederate Service Agent Sergeant George Shadburn had brought the information in that 3,000 cattle were there and were lightly defended by only some 120 soldiers and 30 civilians. Coggins Point was also the site of Edwin Ruffin's plantation. Now, we might have talked about Edmund Ruffin before, him being a pro-secession and pro-slavery politician. He had sent a captured pike from John Brown's raid to every northern governor following the failed effort. So yeah, probably felt good, if you are a Union soldier, to house some northern beef on his property. However, this light defense would prove to be an issue. Forces of the 13th Pennsylvania and 1st D.C. Cavalry were in the area from August Kautz's command. While it was more than reported by Shadburn, it would be still less than the 3,000 troopers that Hampton was assembling for the task. He would grab brigades from Rooney Lee, those being James Deering and Thomas Rosser of his division. Additionally, some men from Pierce Young and John Dunavant's would accompany the mission. Hampton also reportedly gathered some Texas cattle thieves and several dogs to help guide the herd back to friendly lines. Getting there wasn't going to be a problem, but the getting back to friendly lines was going to be an issue. While the plan essentially called for riding around the Union Army, just like Stuart, Lee would point out that the big hinge on the plan was going to be the part where Hampton returns. Hampton's column was set out on September 14th. Fortunately, he would go a route that was not going to be watched by Federals, as a key bridge had been burned. Ordering the bridge to be rebuilt, the Gray troopers would approach their target. With Rooney checking the approach from Petersburg and Deering the other direction, Rosser would be tabbed with getting rid of any Union troops guarding the cows. On the 15th, he would launch his attack, hitting the 1st D.C. Cavalry in an assault that caught them completely off guard. Some 300 Federals would be captured, along with many Henry repeating rifles. Civilians were pressed into driving the cattle. The Confederates were then able to retreat back the way they came. Once across the bridge, they would destroy the rebuilt structure, dissuading a pursuit. Let us hear from Wade Hampton himself giving a report of the action. Headquarters Cavalry Corps, Army of Northern Virginia, September 27, 1864. I have the honor to submit the following report of the operations of the troops under my command during the late expedition to the rear of the enemy. On the morning of the 14th instant, I moved with a division of Major General William H. F. Lee, the brigades of Rosser and Deering, and an attachment of 100 men from Young and Dunavant's brigades, under command of Lieutenant Colonel Miller, 6th South Carolina Regiment, down the west side of Rowanty Creek to Wilkinson's Bridge, on that stream where the command bivouacked that night. The object of the expedition was to attempt the capture of the large herd of cattle, which was reported to be grazing near Coggins Point on the James River. In order to accomplish this, it was necessary to pass in the rear of the enemy and force his lines at some point. I selected Sycamore Church in Prince George County as the point of the attack, as being the most central, the nearest to the cattle, and the one where the largest enemy force of the enemy was camped. By dispersing them here, I made it impossible for them to concentrate any force in time to interfere with the main object of the expedition. The command left Wilkinson's Bridge at early hour of the 15th, and by rapid march placed itself on the Black Water at Cook's Bridge. This bridge had been destroyed, as I was aware, and I chose that route on that account, as the enemy would not look for an approach from that quarter. The command was halted here to rest and feed whilst the engineer party constructed a new bridge. This was accomplished before night, and part of the command crossed the Blackwater. All my dispositions for the attack having been made and communicated to the commanding officers, the command moved at 12 a.m. General Lee was directed to move by the Lawyers Road to the Stage Road, at which point he would encounter the first pickets of the enemy. These he was to drive in, and to move then to occupy the roads leading from the direction of the enemy to Sycamore Church. General Deering was instructed to proceed by the Hines Road to Cox Mill, where he was to halt until the attack by the center was made, when he was to dash upon the Migner's Ferry Road, attacking the post on that road and cutting off all retreat, guarding at the same time against an attack from Fort Powhatan. With Rosser's brigade and the attachment under Colonel Miller, I moved on the by-roads direct toward Sycamore Church. General Rosser, whose charges weigh on the duty of carrying the position of the enemy here, and was directed after accomplishing this to push forward at once to secure the cattle. The three columns all reached the points to which they were ordered without giving an alarm to the enemy, and at 5 a.m. on the 16th, Rosser made the attack. The enemy had a strong position, and the approaches to it being barricaded, he had time to rally in the roads around the camp. where for some time he fought as stubbornly as I've ever seen him do. But the determination and gallantry of Rosser's men proved too much for him, and he was completely routed, leaving his dead and wounded on the field and his camp in our hands. I beg to refer to the report of Brigadier General Rosser for the particulars of the affair here, and of the subsequent capture of the cattle. As soon as the attack was made at the church, General Lee on the left and General Deering on the right attacked the enemy most successfully and established themselves rapidly and firmly at the points they were ordered to secure. The reports of these officers are enclosed for the information of the commanding general. The object of the expedition having been attained by the capture of the whole herd of cattle, 2,486 by official return of the officer charged to carry them, I withdrew everything before 8 a.m. The different columns were, until before reaching the Blackwater, and all dispositions made to protect our captured property. Rosser was sent forward to hold the plank road, followed by General Deering and Colonel Miller, whilst General Lee brought up the rear. After seeing everything across the Blackwater, I moved toward the plank road, but before reaching it, was notified by General Rosser of the approach of a heavy force of the enemy down that road. I ordered him to take position at Ebenezer Church, to hold the road there, and at once sent the cattle by Hawkinsville, crossing the plank road 2 miles in the rear of my main line of battle. Major Venable of my staff was ordered to superintend this movement of the cattle, and with Major Riles, Provost Marshal, who had been very efficient in conducting up to this time, to place quickly across the Nottoway River at Freeman's Ford. These officers discharged this duty admirably, and the successful manner in which the cattle are brought off is due very much to their zeal and enterprise. The enemy had in the meantime attacked Rosser, who held his ground steadily. I sent Miller to him, and soon after Deering. This force held the position so easily that I determined to pass the rear of the enemy with General Lee's division in order to attack him there. Before proper dispositions to do this could be made, however, it became too dark to make the movement advantageously, and I directed General Lee to reinforce Rosser and to protect our right. These orders were promptly carried out in the midst of an attack from the enemy, who were repulsed along the whole line. Several assaults were made on me, but always with a like result. Major Chew placed his artillery in position, and after a heavy fire of an hour, completely silenced the guns of the enemy. Hearing that the cattle were all safely across the Nottoway, and fearing that the enemy might throw a force around my left so as to interpose between the cattle and my command, I determined not to follow the enemy, who were falling back, but to move to Wilkinson's Bridge, where I could check any flank movement. Leaving 4 squadrons on picket at the church, I moved the command to their former bivouac on the Routani. Halting for the night, I intended to attack the enemy the next morning if he could be found, but discovered he had retreated during the night. The next day, the command returned to their old quarters after an absence of 3 days, during which they had marched upward of 100 miles, defeating the enemy in 2 fights, and bringing him his line's safety a large of captured property, together with 304 prisoners. Of the 2,486 cattle captured, 2,468 have been brought in, and I hope to get the few remaining ones. 3 guidons were taken and 11 wagons brought in safely, several others having been destroyed. 3 camps of the enemy were burned, after securing from one some very valuable stores, including quite a number of blankets. My loss was 10 killed, 47 wounded, and 4 missing. Now, a couple things to unpack here. Number 1, the Confederate horse artillery has become quite effective. You can kind of get that from here, where maybe they're not facing veteran units exactly, but they become very effective in terms of going toe-to-toe with their Union counterpart. Now, there's always going to be more Union artillery than there will be Confederate artillery, but the veterans in the Army of Northern Virginia do a very good job. You know, we talked about during the Crater how the artillery essentially is going to be the only ones who are going to hold up the Confederate line long enough for reinforcements to actually arrive on the field and then throw back the disorganized Union attack. So we have a pretty good highlight of that. You know, Chew has been in our story for quite some time. He's constantly being mentioned in these cavalry battles. So he has, and his artillery battery have been doing some good work for some time. And obviously the Confederates have some pretty formidable artillery, if not a whole lot of it. Overall, this is really going to be quite the Jeb Stuart-like performance. And certainly there was a lot of consternation from Lee and from the Confederate public of, you know, who's going to replace this guy. And we kind of highlighted how, you know, there's kind of a drop off in the Jeb Stuart performance as the war progresses. And part of that is that the Federal cavalry becomes better equipped, I think, number one, and then also better trained and more experienced, right? You have more of a culture of horses in the South, more of a culture of being a knight, a cavalier, right? So obviously the Confederate cavalry in the beginning of the war is going to be superior, and then the Union Army is going to catch up in terms of experience and training, and the Spencer repeating and the breechload and carbines are obviously going to be very effective toward closing that gap, right? But then if you're flipping around to Wade Hampton, you're probably seeing these huge shoes that you have to fill. And we often talk about in the Confederacy and the Union Army how sometimes things are not a great fit. Sometimes you really need somebody to take over the command of, say, an army, and there's not really a whole lot of great options. Well, Hampton and Fitzhugh Lee were two very solid options, but I really do think that Hampton is more what the Confederacy needs. He's more of the Cavalier type. He's obviously a little bit more flamboyant, being, what some people called the richest man in the South prior to the outbreak of the war. So definitely, as we get into the latter stages of the war, what the Confederacy needs in terms of a cavalry officer. Getting the cattle back to the supply lines is going to be a huge boost to the morale of the Confederates. Not only that, it's going to provide some much needed supplies. Obviously, they could use 2,400 cattle to be slaughtered and then obviously be turned into beef for the army. That's also going to be a huge boon to their supply efforts. And we mentioned in the Patreon episode how during the 7 days there was a shift in momentum really when Jeb Stuart has this ride around McClellan. Now, that was really more of a fact-finding mission than anything. He finds out that the flank is in the air, right? And that's going to have Lee spark these ideas, Beaver Dam Creek or Mechanicsville, and then Gaines's Mill, these two battles where he's going to try to come in on the flank and take out the isolated part of the army. This is kind of similar, right? Where you're seeing Hampton kind of ride into the Union lines. He's able to have this great raid, comes off, very little loss for the Confederates, so pretty big success. And then maybe they're trying to spark some of that changing of momentum. And unfortunately, Ulysses Grant is very different than George B. McClellan, and it's just not going to be the same situation on the ground. And the last thing that I will mention, and this is something that is probably going to be on the short list of movies that we might watch and review as far as the Patreon, another Patreon plug there. If you think that this sounds familiar, this kind of storyline sounds familiar, and you've seen the William Holden movie, Alvarez Kelly, that also has Richard Widmark in it, the events in that movie are actually based on the Beefsteak raid, right? Actually, the main Confederate officer in that movie is Rossiter, so pretty close to Rosser. I think he's kind of the stand-in for Wade Hampton and Thomas Rosser at the same time. So if, once again, the storyline sounds familiar and you've seen that movie perhaps, then it's actually based on that. And that's actually on the list of movies that we might be doing here in a future episode. And we'll talk about, of course, the historical significance and the accuracy, even though it's based on these events, it's not actually 100% supposed to be accurate, right? A little bit different. So I think they play more in that movie toward the cattle thieves than anything, and not quite as prominent a part in the actual, say, report that we just read from Wade Hampton. But we do know he did recruit some individuals to join him. And so if that sounds like something that would interest you, we're probably going to be doing that down the line, but just also figured I'd mention it here as well. We must talk about the end of John Hunt Morgan to close out the episode. Morgan, like Stuart, is an interesting and controversial character. He launches several unauthorized ventures, including his raid into Ohio, but at the same time he was a decent cavalry officer and a morale boost to the South. Well, as we know, his last raid into Kentucky does not go very well. His men were more brigands than they were soldiers, his command shattered by the raids. Despite this failure, Morgan would be granted command of a department of the Confederacy. Such was his popularity. You remember he kind of turns in some pretty good performances in Southwest Virginia does a pretty good job. He was supposed to make his way up to Newmarket for that battle, but he obviously is occupied with the Crook Averell expedition that goes into the south there. So he has been serving in that area since we kind of talked about that Kentucky command. Moving to Greenville, Tennessee in September, he would wish to press on Knoxville. Now, this is an interesting notion. Remember, East Tennessee was a priority for the Federals. It would also mean that there was a lot of pro-Union individuals in the area. Also remember that Knoxville is not necessarily like an easy city just to go ahead and take. So if you have Morgan, who has maybe a couple thousand, if we're being generous, troopers who are not necessarily troopers, and Longstreet wasn't able to take Knoxville back in 1863. Granted, there was a lot more of a force there in terms of like the 9th Corps by Ambrose Burnside, but here we go with Morgan thinking that he could also just go ahead and take Knoxville, where perhaps an actual army of Confederates, actual corps, failed. Morgan would stop at a Mrs. Williams' house. The Williamses having one son serving the Union Army and another in the Confederate Army. Nearby Union troops were alerted to the whereabouts of the rebels. Originally believing there were far less troopers, they would ride out, but soon realized that there were maybe some 1,500. While they probably could not take the Confederate camp, as there were quite a lot of them, they did have an opportunity to isolate Morgan. The Williams residence was surrounded, with Morgan attempting to flee with some fellow officers. While one surrendered and another escaped, Andrew Campbell would fire on Morgan, killing him with a shot to the chest. Campbell would live a tough life, being the individual who killed Morgan, becoming kind of a pariah. Another of the key cavalry chiefs of the South was dead, though. It's hard to really evaluate the significance of Morgan. I sort of think his star was descending. However, once again, he was a key morale figure. His loss would certainly be mourned, and maybe individuals in Indiana, Ohio would breathe a little easier. If we really think about Morgan and his raids, his accomplishments, right, was the Ohio raid necessarily the best idea? Does he almost actually get away with it? It does actually sort of make sense in a way, if we're being generous. He did not have the authorization to do it. Obviously, he's disobeying orders. Obviously, the Army under Braxton Bragg probably could have used some additional cavalry as we get into the Tullahoma campaign, and then subsequently the loss of Chattanooga, Chickamauga. Maybe could have used Morgan, right? Maybe could have used his men. Up until that point, though, he had done a pretty good job. His first Kentucky raid had been fairly successful. That had happened around the same time that Forrest is also conducting a raid, and the Confederate cavalry is, for a time, kind of staving off the Union infantry. Grant is starting to try to figure out how to get at Vicksburg at that point, so having these raids in the rear of the operations is not going to go well toward trying to get at that objective, right? And we have the Battle of Hartsville, which is a pretty big success, in which Morgan captures quite a lot of troops, and that is prior to Stones River. That's all the way, 62, 63 right there. So there are some pretty big contributions that we kind of overlook with John Hunt Morgan, because he's kind of going on this downward spiral as we get through the war. But we also kind of see how his style of war is very laissez-faire in terms of discipline, right? His men, again, more criminals toward the end than anything. So we have that kind of going back to bite him in the end. And it's very similar. A lot of people kind of lump John Hunt Morgan in as, say, like a guerrilla, more of a regular soldier. And maybe he would have been better in that capacity, but I also think it's kind of unfair to say that as well, because he does do well in terms of some conventional battles, some conventional warfare. So it's always kind of complicated with these characters, especially when you're thinking about them in retrospect here, as we've gone through our narrative, and now we're kind of doing a little, shall we say, eulogy for them, I guess. While some of them kind of are cut and dry, I think John Hunt Morgan has been a tougher one for me to kind of think through. So let's go ahead and call it a day right there. We had the famous Beefsteak raid, which will help the Confederacy. Not only was this a boost in morale, but also gave valuable beef to the Confederates in Petersburg. We had to say goodbye to John Hunt Morgan, the general being killed in Tennessee. Next week, we will take some time to cover politics. Yes, that is right. We will talk a little bit about the 1864 presidential election. After doing that, we will have a brief setup of events that will shift momentum in the Shenandoah Valley as we will begin the 1864 campaign that will pit Sheridan against Early. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website, as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.